Hi, thank you for coming. Welcome. Tobias Jonathan Ansel Wolff is a short story writer, memoirist, novelist, and teacher of literature and creative writing. Almost alone among contemporary writers, he's exemplary in each one of these genres. He's won the Faulkner Award for fiction, and he received a National Medal of Arts from President Barack Obama when we had a president who read literature. He's taught in two of the great centers for fiction in America, at Syracuse University, and since 1997, he's been the Priscilla B. Woods Professor of Humanities at Stanford. I'm actually, for the first time, I think, reading a biography that came from Wikipedia, because this one happened to be so good. I learned things. I've known Mr. Wolff for probably 20 years, and I learned things from this. Tobias Wolff was born in 1945 in Birmingham, Alabama, the second son of Rosemary Loftus from Hartford, Connecticut, and Arthur Samuels Wolff, an aeronautical engineer, who was the son of a Jewish doctor and his wife. The father had become Episcopalian, and Wolff did not learn about his father's Jewish roots until he was an adult. He was raised and identifies as Catholic, like his mother. His parents separated when Wolff was 5 and his elder brother Jeffrey was 12. He lived with his mother in a variety of places, including Seattle, Washington, when he was an adolescent. After she remarried, they lived in a small company town in the North Cascade Mountains where his stepfather worked at Seattle City Light. His father and brother lived on the East Coast during this period. Jeffrey knew nothing about where Tobias was until Jeffrey entered Princeton. As a kid, Wolff had a local paper route and was a Boy Scout. After attending Concrete High School, yes, concrete, like concrete, in the town of Concrete, also in the North Cascades, Wolff applied to and was accepted by the Hill School, located 35 miles from Philadelphia. He applied under the self-embellished name Tobias Jonathan von Anselm Wolff III, adopting part of one of his father's personae. Saunders Ansel Wolff III, when Wolff was found to have forged his transcripts and recommendation letters, he was later expelled. During the Vietnam War era, he served in the U.S. Army from 68 to 72 when he trained for special forces, learned Vietnamese, and served as an advisor in Vietnam. He holds a first-class honors degree in English from Hertford College, Oxford. After returning to the U.S. in 1975, he was awarded a Wallace Stegner Fellowship in Creative Writing at Stanford, where he earned an M.A. He's the brother of the great writer Jeffrey Wolff and has been married to the same woman for nearly 44 years. As Wyatt Mason wrote in the London Review of Books, typically Tobias Wolff's protagonists face an acute moral dilemma, unable to reconcile what they know to be true with what they feel to be true. Duplicity is their great failing and Wolff's main theme. In 1989, Wolff was chosen as the recipient of the Rea Award for the short story. He's received the O'Henry Award on 3 separate occasions, and he's also, in 2008, was awarded the Story Prize for Our Story Begins. We all come to books and writers in a different way, and I just wanted to say that Tobias Wolff's first book, In the Garden of the North American Martyrs, I learned today it was his second book. There's actually a first novel, which he doesn't even admit to having written. But his first collection of short stories, when it came out, was the first book I ever bought more than one copy of. I literally bought, I think, 10 copies to give to friends. And this was a big deal for me because I was, in my early 20s and money was short and I was in graduate school, but it was at that wonderful moment where I felt like giving you this will be a great experience for you and will change you and will make us be great friends. And it proved to be true. Anyway, please welcome Tobias Wolff. Thank you.
Good evening. Thank you, Mona. I have one correction to make to the introduction, only one. I wish that I had been expelled for the much more interesting sin of forging my recommendations. I flunked out. I couldn't pass Algebra 2 for the life of me. They only found out later that I forged them when I admitted it. What I think I'm going to do tonight is I'm going to read a short story that is not in any of my collections. It's a more recent story. And then I'm going to read a couple of excerpts from a novel that I am now finishing. I'm hoping to hand it in sometime this spring, and about time, too. This story is called All Ahead of Them. And I met with some students this evening before coming over here, and we were talking about, what is the story? What makes a story? And I remembered this dictum of Chekhov's that all you need is a man, a woman, and an ashtray. And I kind of took that challenge in a way to heart in writing this story because there's no even an ashtray in this story. And it's called All Ahead of Them. These people have just been married. They're on their honeymoon. It's all a misunderstanding, he said. I'm just on my way somewhere. I'll call you later, okay? His mouth was so dry he could hardly get the words out, and he heard the strain in his brother's voice as they said their goodbyes. He closed the phone and laid it on the bedside table. The French doors were open, and he could see a slice of the harbor above the balcony railing. The mattress squeaked as he rocked to his feet. He walked outside and stood at the railing. He wanted a cigarette, but he'd promised to quit after the wedding and had managed to keep his word so far, despite the half-pack of Giton forgotten by a previous guest in the bottom drawer of the dresser. Late sunlight glittered on the water and brightened the hulls of the boats in the marina. A pair of paisley pajama bottoms hung from a clothesline on the roof across the street, the legs dancing madly in the gusty breeze. He and Arden had laughed at the spectacle barely an hour ago. Now he found it unsettling, humanly desperate. He had understood, even as he used the word misunderstanding, always mealy on the tongue, always prelude to an alibi, that there'd been no misunderstanding, which meant that his wife of 6 days was a liar and a thief. Well. A vein throbbed in his forehead. His tongue felt gritty. He lowered himself into one of the deck chairs and drank from the glass of water he'd left on his guidebook. The ice had melted, leaving a metallic taste. The cover of the guidebook was damp from the sweating glass. He wiped it on his pant leg and opened to the page he'd been reading. A few moments later, he shut the book. The words were swimming on the page. He lowered the back of the chair and closed his eyes, hoping to calm himself. But instead, he saw himself from a distance, striking this easy pose, performing relaxation. For whom? For himself, to demonstrate how little shaken he was? The sense of being ridiculous made him sit forward sullenly, legs on either side of the chair. A motorino whined in the street below. Minutes ago, before the call, he had been planning tomorrow's walk to Vernazza. It was what he and Arden had come here to do, hiked the cliffside trails from village to village, and he had almost lost himself in plotting their route, looking for good beaches, picking likely restaurants. He'd been able to make love that morning for the first time since the wedding, and could just begin to contemplate the week to come without a cramp of dread. He'd had this trouble with Arden a few times before, but he'd assumed that it would pass once the anxieties of getting married were behind them. Arden was being okay about it, understanding, even though she didn't understand. How could she when he didn't understand? He knew that she was trying to make it easier for him, but when she told him not to worry, that it happened to men all the time, he was not reassured. Her sympathy was withering enough, but all the time? Where did that knowledge come from? The wisdom of others, he hoped. But what sort of conversation would invite those others to make such a revelation? Would he himself become fodder for sharing over drinks on some girls' night out or during one of Arden's cooking classes? The very thought of it unmanned him. Arden hadn't given up, but in her attempts to rouse him, he had begun to suspect something beyond concern, even beyond impatience, boredom. "It's okay, Bud," she'd said last night when all had failed. "Let's get some sleep." His name was Thomas, and he liked to think of himself as Thomas, but everyone called him Bud. Not even Tom, just Bud. Ever since he was a baby, apparently because an aunt of his had said that he looked just like a bud in his little green onesie. The nickname had begun to grate as time went on, especially from people who didn't know him well, as if they'd called him Mac or Pal. Though he knew they didn't mean to presume, it affected him that way. Arden could imbue the name with tenderness, but she could also, as on the night before, sound like a stranger turning down the offer of a drink. Arden wasn't her real name. She'd created it by flipping her given name backward. She had been named after her father's mother, Nedra, who'd been sentenced to 25 years in prison for selling marijuana to other teachers in the Buffalo High School, where she taught music. This was back in the 70s under the Rockefeller laws. She had hanged herself in her cell after 3 years. A beautiful woman, everyone said, a talented pianist and singer. Arden's father had been a young boy when Nedra was taken away and never got over it. Above the fireplace, he kept an oil portrait of her, copied at some expense from a photograph. He still couldn't talk about her without getting choked up. So they had this in common, Arden and Bud, both of them known by names that weren't really theirs, though of course he'd been saddled with his, and she had chosen hers. He didn't blame her. Arden was a beautiful name, a poetic name. In fact, he had been interested in her even before they met, just from hearing some mutual friends talk about her. And when those friends brought them together for dinner, she somehow was Arden, willowy, formal, old-fashioned, in a crushed velvet dress and high boots, her heart-shaped face framed by strands of dark hair that kept escaping from the bun she wore. She had an air of innocence and sincerity that touched him. She seemed unworldly, more spirit than flesh, and he still found himself hesitant to approach her, to take her, afraid of seeming crass, hungry, merely carnal. He was careful with Arden, slow, gentle, but afterward he sometimes sensed a disappointment in her that made him feel rough and clumsy. Arden's change of name had hurt her father, who still insisted on calling her Nedra. even despite the pleas of his daughter and wife when giving his meandering, tearful toast at the wedding reception. There had been puzzled looks on the faces of some of the guests, as if they'd wandered into the wrong party, and Thomas realized that his bride had kept her given name secret from many of them, even close friends from college and the clinic where she worked as a speech therapist. She'd been in no hurry to tell him either. He'd found out only when going to meet her parents for the first time. She had briefed him in the car on their way to the house. The story of her name, her grandmother's prison sentence, and suicide, all accounted for in a cool, flat recital of the facts during the last few minutes of the drive. "So when Dad calls me Nedra, that's why," she said as he pulled to the curb. She got out of the car and waved at someone. Thomas sat there in a daze until she rapped on the roof of the car. "Come on, Bud, they're waiting." Whenever they visited Arden's family, Thomas found himself studying the portrait of her grandmother. He'd smoked some weed in high school and college. Not much. It made him unpleasantly self-conscious, tongue-tied. But he didn't see any harm in it. Certainly not enough to lock someone up, as they used to do, just for having a few joints. But Nedra had more than a few joints when they busted her. She had a pound of the stuff, and precision scales, and special baggies, and several $1,000s in an account hitherto unknown to her husband. She'd been an actual dealer, an ambitious dealer too, expanding her customer base to young professors in the local colleges, though that hadn't come out until after her death and the repeal of the laws. She got busted after the vice principal of her school ran a red light after a Christmas party, and the cop saw a fat spliff roll out of the glove compartment when the poor man opened it to show his registration. Stoned, hysterical, he immediately offered up Nedra, and that was that. The portrait fascinated Thomas. Nedra was looking down at a Siamese cat in her lap, and yes, she was beautiful, but not in the ethereal way that Arden was beautiful. Her hair was short and blonde, almost white, and her nose slightly upturned, where Arden's was aquiline. She wore a short-sleeved shirt, and her arms were plump, rounded, both wrists circled with gold bracelets. Her lips were painted a deep red. Musician and purveyor of marijuana she might be, but there was nothing of the artistic hippie about Nedra. In fact, she looked sort of Republican, in the way of his own grandmother and his aunts and their friends, a type he'd always been attracted to. Women who smoked and drank cocktails and wore glittering rings and perfume and mink coats, which he liked to hang up for them, stroking the fur that somehow brought in the cold on winter nights. Nedra was smiling down at the cat, and Thomas couldn't help seeing something secretive in that smile, something withheld and power-giving, and maybe not so nice. And he liked that, liked knowing how different Nedra had been from what she seemed. A dealer, an outlaw. But he understood that he was probably reading things into the portrait. Thomas had packed his father's old army Zippo. Just out of sentiment, he was definitely quitting. He fetched it, then took the pack of gitans from under his shirts, tapped a cigarette out, and rolled it between his thumb and forefinger. It was dry, stale. He went back onto the balcony and propped his elbows on the railing. The lighter flared at the first roll of the flint. He roasted the tip of the cigarette over the tall, oily flame, relishing the faint crackle of the leaves. The first drag went right to his head. He closed his eyes. He felt himself swaying a little. Oh, but it was good. He took another hit off the cigarette and opened his eyes to the astonishing sight of the pajama bottoms performing a can-can. One leg up and down, then the other again and again. He laughed in spite of himself. His dizziness passed. He went on smoking and thinking, darkly. One last drag, and he flicked the cigarette down toward the empty lane. It landed on an awning. Metal, fortunately. That would have made his day, burning the hotel down. Wasn't he the lucky one? So, the misunderstanding. What to do? Libby, his brother's wife, never had her fingers off the phone. She texted while doing crossword puzzles, throwing a frisbee for their neurotic Weimaraner, even changing diapers. By now, everyone in the family probably knew. Jenny and Claire, the other bridesmaids, lived downstate, and Libby hadn't met them before the wedding, but she could track them down. Maybe she already had. What would they think? They'd been Arden's roommates at Skidmore, her closest friends, and Libby, tireless busybody though she was, had a good heart. She'd taken Arden under her wing, treated her like a sister, even helped her plan the wedding. But of course it was Libby who'd discovered the crime, and now she was on the warpath. Arden had picked out the dresses for her bridesmaids at a shop Libby had recommended. The dresses cost more than $500 each, which seemed a ridiculous sum to Thomas, but apparently was not out of bounds for the fancy wedding they were having. Libby and Jenny and Claire seemed to take the price in stride. They deputized Arden to buy the dresses for them and paid her back without a squeak. And the dresses were beautiful. Thomas had to admit that. In fact, the word that came to him was stunning. It seemed a woman's kind of word, so he didn't say it, but he thought it when he saw the three women together in the church, excited, weepy, glowing in emerald green silk that rustled as they danced attendance on their cool ivory queen. He'd been happy to admire what he hadn't had to pay for, though he knew he'd have found the dresses less appealing if they'd cost him 500 bills. The problem was that they hadn't cost Arden 500 bills either. That was the original price, still on the tags when she sent them to Libby and Jenny and Claire, but the dresses had been marked down by half when she bought them. Libby had taken hers back to the shop after the wedding for some minor adjustment, and the chatty owner had unwittingly exposed Arden's scam. $250 each, $750 altogether. Not exactly peanuts, but hardly a killing either. The senior partners in his law firm made that much in an hour. He wasn't doing badly himself and would do even better as time went on, and Arden had been given a nice bump in pay just 2 months ago. So why do it? It couldn't have been about the money. It was something else, a sort of impulse or itch. For what? The tingle of risk, of stepping over the line? A sort of adventure, maybe. The release of something held in, perhaps her very self. Thomas's mother had told him of a recurrent dream in which she woke in her own bed in her own house and descended the stairs to find a strange man sitting at her kitchen table. He was wearing a military uniform and bore a livid scar across one cheek. Upon seeing Thomas's mother in the doorway, he rose and greeted her as his wife. Approaching her with arms outstretched, she told Thomas this story twice, both times with a bemused smile. Now he felt as if he had somehow entered such a dream himself. Who was she? Who was this woman? It was shocking. That is, he supposed he should be shocked. But here was the fact stipulated. He wasn't shocked. Embarrassed, to be sure, but not shocked. That seemed odd to him. He had to wonder, why not? And this question brought to mind the stories that Arden told when she showed up late for a dinner or a movie or just about anything. She was always late and always had a story. Thomas accepted these often flimsy narratives as a form of apology. In his limited experience, beautiful women did not generally feel obliged to make excuses. And there was something endearing about Arden's inventions. A woman had slipped on a patch of ice and she'd had to wait until the ambulance came. Her office door had locked behind her with the keys inside while the security guard was on break. One night, having kept Thomas pacing outside a concert hall for more than half an hour, she told him that she'd had to give a client a ride home because his car had been stolen from the clinic lot. Then she repeated that excuse a few months later in pretty much the same words. It was as if she didn't expect him to believe her, as if it were part of a game he'd bought into, as he guessed he had, because he never called her on any of it. No, that would have spoiled what he took to be an understanding between them, that she could spin transparent yarns and he would indulge her, would even be amused by their transparency. This arrangement afforded him the pleasure of a silent, paternal chuckle while keeping things honest between them, with Arden weaving her tales and knowing, as she must have, that he understood them to be concoctions and would forgive her little deceptions in light of her willingness to offer him alibis. So he'd imagined. But what if he'd been wrong? What if she thought that he believed her? Thomas shook out another cigarette and let it dangle unlit from the corner of his mouth. The breeze was dying, the sky darkening into evening. The pajama legs hung listless from the line, now and then giving a little ripple, as if in a faint memory of the dance they'd performed. Could she actually think he was buying her stories? He wouldn't have thought it possible, except that he saw that it was possible. There was the night in April when she got her raise and insisted on taking him to dinner at Bistro Cloud. Flushed with the praise she'd received from the clinic's director, she was unusually and delicately hungry. She kept the waitress running for this dish and that dish, a demi of Bordeaux to follow the bottle they'd drunk, dessert, coffee, brandy. He'd never seen her so voracious. They had left the restaurant and were about to cross the street when their waitress came running out and called to them. They stopped. It was cold, and the waitress, in a white silk blouse, hugged herself as she came toward them. Was there something wrong with the service, she asked. Her eyes were on Arden, her face pallid under the streetlight. Was the service not up to your standard? The service was fine, Arden said. So fine is not worth a tip? Arden turned to Thomas. You didn't leave the tip? No, I thought. He shook his head. My fault. What was the bill? The waitress named the sum, and Thomas gave her a couple of 20s, almost 30%. She took them without a word and returned to the restaurant. I thought you left the tip, Arden said, looking straight at him. Doesn't the man always do that? He had believed her, or at least had managed to think that he believed her. So why did that night come back to him so vividly now? There was something there that didn't make sense, that he'd skated over, let go, given how easy and sure she'd been, as if the mistake really had been his. But when she had paid the bill, she hadn't told him what it came to, so how could he have known what the tip should be? It was of a piece with this dress business, and when you got right down to it, with certain other things, the handicapped parking sticker she'd somehow got her hands on, the years overdue library books, little things, nothing much by themselves, but making a sort of rhyme when you put them together. Thomas was not shocked, or in fact, surprised. He was even a little relieved, strange as that seemed to him. He understood that he must have known all along. Now he was free of the work of pretending to himself that he didn't know. So, how to explain this dress business? Because it was up to him to produce an explanation, and in such a way that the matter would be put to rest. And in a way that left Arden unaware that she'd been found out, so that she would not avoid his family or feel awkward in their presence. And she must not know that he had handled it, that he knew. She would never forgive him for knowing. He could not risk losing her. He had pledged himself, and not only in the words of the ceremony. When he'd first met Arden, she was engaged to an art dealer, a rich man, Austrian. She had thrown all calculation aside in leaving him for Thomas, a fledgling lawyer, a former social worker, and married him. He'd wondered if he was equal to her trust in him. Well, by God, he was. He was. He could come up with a story for Libby and the others. He could say that he himself had picked up the dresses and forgotten to mention the sale to Arden, that she had billed them according to the price still indicated on the tags. Okay, not that story. Maybe, but something like it that had at least a decent possibility of being true. Whatever he came up with would be supported by the evidence of the money he'd send them, and of course he would beg them not to mention his embarrassing mistake to Arden. He would draw the funds from his account, not yet merged with Arden's, and then open another at a different bank so that he could write other such checks as occasion required. For there would surely be other occasions as the years went on, other confusions, misunderstandings, to be explained and smoothed over and set right with a roll of the old green, generously fattened to keep things between ourselves so that his wife wouldn't find out. The mistake would be his, always his. He could see the two of them years from now sitting in the stands of some middle school gym while their son ran up and down the court on skinny legs, or their daughter's choir sang inspirational songs. He would look at his beautiful wife and know, and be glad in his knowledge and in her certainty of his innocence. That bad girl, where was she? She'd gone out to do some shopping. How long could that take? He took the cigarette from his lips, held it over the railing as if to drop it, then lit it. He paced the balcony and smoked. Nedra would come back laden with packages. She would model the clothes for him, changing in front of him, taking things off, bending over as he watched. He would demand it. She would hear the thickness in his voice and hesitate and smile. He knew that smile. He could see it. His mother's smile as she remembered the scarred stranger in her kitchen and how she'd entered his embrace. That's it. I will read a couple of very short bits from a novel I'm working on, this novel that I mentioned earlier. I will just read this one short bit here. This man, he's an English teacher in a Catholic boys' high school, and he's had trouble with his wife and has gone for a time to live in his sister's apartment. His adult son has come over to try to talk some sense into him. And this is where this section picks up. His son has just said to him, "You should go home. Really, Dad, you should go home." And what did I think of when he said that? Not what he intended. The word dad blew me right out of the kitchen, took me back to when he was just a little boy and I his hero. He'd call up to me from the driveway when he got home with Anne Marie after nursery school or a shopping run or a trip to the park. "Dad, Dad." And I would come to the window of the cramped room on the second floor where I prepared classes and graded papers and wave at him, his big moon face turning red with pleasure. "There's Dad," he would shout, and keep after Anne Marie until she too had waved up at me, waggling her fingers over an armful of groceries. Then I would blow her a kiss and turn grudgingly back to my students' papers, red pencil in hand. Oh, those papers. Essays by boys who didn't like books, most of them, and wrote only under stern compulsion. Unreadable essays, but I read them, had to read them for duty's sake and our daily bread. Jumping up to prowl the room when brought to despair by such offerings as, on Uncle Tom's Cabin, black and white lifestyles in the Old South, or Why I Feel Slavery is Wrong. How many essays have I read through the years? Tens of thousands, no, hundreds of thousands, and still alive to tell the tale. Amazing. Sometimes, to break the monotony, I've had my students write stories. That presents its own hazards. Over time, I've been treated to handwritten but word-perfect copies of The Gift of the Magi, To Build a Fire, and The Killers, among others. It's been better since the school took in girls. They've raised the game. But only last fall, 3 of the football players in my junior class turned in stories that began with the words, "Little did I know." I decided to treat it as a joke. On a rainy December afternoon all those years ago, my furious pacing brought me to the window, and there was George, still standing in the driveway long after I thought he'd gone inside, gazing down at a puddle. There was a deep sag in the asphalt there. I kept meaning to complain to the landlord, but who thinks about a pothole when you're not actually banging through it? The puddle was big enough that I could see the ripples on its surface breaking into miniature combers on the far shore. George, in his shiny yellow slicker, stood pondering this body of water, head bent, hands clasped behind his back. He was what, 4, 5, and already a philosopher. And now it seemed he somehow knew how to look like one. I watched him. What was he thinking? Maybe he was mulling over one of those big questions he still trusted me to answer. Do germs have legs? Do sheep have trouble with moths? How many kids have to swim to school? Or, the time approaching Christmas, something even bigger, a needling doubt raised by some over-informed child in daycare. Is Santa Claus real? A dangerous question, this, the Santa perplex. You either reinforce your earlier complicity in the myths of the season, cheerful and innocent as they seemed at the time, or you tell the bald truth, a truth that will bring you no credit, as telling it will demolish a pleasant and profitable belief, while revealing you as a liar for the first untruth you committed and all its corollary fictions. And it will also reveal the entire adult world as colluding in falsehood and illusion. What about the Santa cutouts on rooftops and lawns, the displays in store windows, the TV commercials and magazine ads, the wish list solemnly addressed to the North Pole? Lies? Really? Nothing but lies? Once you've tasted the fruit of that knowledge, you can never go back. If your mother and father and uncles and aunts and teachers and neighbors and babysitters and even strangers can all get together to fool you on this, what else are they fooling you about? Once begun, the list of possible hoaxes is endless, beginning with the jolly old elf and going on to cherubim and seraphim, the cowardice of bullies, American exceptionalism, the march of human progress, divinely inspired texts, and finally the divine inspirer himself, with plenty of casualties in between, not least the moral stature of your parents. After such knowledge, what forgiveness? But really, what kind of father tells his little boy, Santa Claus, are you kidding? Don't be a sap. Santa's just a way to sell toys and make poor kids feel left out. It was such a question as this I found myself anticipating that day years ago, watching my son in his contemplations. But I soon came to see that George must have a different matter in mind. That is, weighing the pleasure of leaping into the middle of that puddle against the discomfort of wet shoes and the vexation of his mother. He gave the question close study and decided for joy. He went into a crouch, rocking back and forth, fists clenched at his sides, eyes on the water. He gathered himself and jumped. He made a good splash. The water covered his shoes. He stood there a while and sloshed through the puddle and down the driveway and up the steps to face Anne-Marie. Careful man that I then was, how I admired him. How did we get from that day to this? By what steps did he ascend and I descend? When did the adoring son achieve this goodly height, to look down on his father in a wallow of schoolboy confusion? Maybe that's purpling it up a bit, but there was a certain adult distance in George's manner this day. Distance and love, and, hardest of all to see, pity. Thank you.
That's wonderful. Thank you. That's so exciting. Oh, thank you so much. I'm still reeling from that. That's really something. What part of the book is that in?
That section is fairly early on in the book.
And the narrator is our narrator throughout.
That narrator, I hope you are not tired of him yet.
Not at all.
Because you're going to, if you read the book, you'll hear a lot more from him.
That moment where the son chooses for joy and jumps in the puddle is just thrilling. And the idea that the father's up there watching and rooting for him to vex the mother, that's just, it's kind of all there. It's fabulous. Can you talk to us about the the composition of this book? How long have you been working on it, and what particular challenges it's posed?
Well, it's hard to talk about a novel that isn't done yet, of course, but it is pretty
Nearly
close,
done.
pretty close to being done. The narrator is has reason to a fairly dire reason, in fact, to kind of confront his own mortality in this, and it launches him back on a kind of view of his past. So a lot of the novel is retrospective. And the other piece I was going to read is even farther back in his life than this.
Have you written it chronologically? Have you written it sequentially? I mean, from the beginning to the end of the book?
Oh, I don't skip around when I'm writing, yeah. Yes, that's right. Mm-hmm.
It's really exciting.
Well, we'll see.
And you're expecting it to be done this year?
I hope this spring, yeah. I've been working on it for some years now.
And you wrote this story while doing
Yes,
this
I
novel?
broke. Sometimes this guy's company becomes unbearable, to tell you the truth. And I mean, there's always the danger in writing first-person narratives that you'll start to feel like this person who you're living with is a narcissist. Why doesn't he shut up? And why is he always talking about himself and what he's done? And I mean, you could say the same thing about Call Me Ishmael and Moby Dick. I mean, or any first-person narrative. And in fact, the reader will have a different experience in entering the novel because the reader is not living with this person for years.
Plus, you must. I'm assuming. I'm assuming maybe this is wrong, but you must write a lot about him and know a lot about him and hear a lot from him that you're not putting in the novel.
Yes, right. It's funny. To
So
what extent, as time goes on, I find the process of writing is the process of throwing stuff out. I mean, it doesn't seem like what I had in mind when I started this vocation, but anyway. I remember somebody asked the great writer Evan Cannell once about, what is your process as a writer? And he said, I sit in a little room for hours a day and I put semicolons in and take semicolons out. And as a description of cruel and unusual punishment, the privileged life of a writer, it could be constitutionally under attack. But anyway.
What is your method? What is your method, one could say, of discarding? Do you work on one page, writing it, rewriting it, throwing it out, changing it until it's done?
Well, when I come back to a body of work that I've written, and I guess the question I always ask myself is, if I were a reader, would I need this? And if I, as a reader, I mean, of course, I'm having to do a kind of trick by putting myself in the mind of a reader who doesn't know what I know. But I think I'm okay at it, and I would ask, do I really need this? Is just really adding to the pattern that I've already established unnecessarily? And that's if the answer is yes, I don't know. I guess I think of the best writing as a compliment, if you will, to or a belief that the reader is as smart and discerning and sensitive to language and as oneself. And so why tell the reader something that you don't need to be told?
Right. Although you
Now,
know so much.
There's always the danger that that you can start cutting muscle off with fat. But I'd rather take that risk than leaving fat in.
And do you tend to write a whole draft and then go back, or do you do it like
unfortunately,
little by little?
That in the old days when I worked on a typewriter, that is how you did it. You just had to keep going and running those pages through the platen. The curse of the computer is that it offers you the chance to be constantly revising, and it's a temptation that I have a hard time resisting. So yeah, I mean, it can get pathological sometimes. this project should not have lasted as long as it has, actually.
And how long has it been going?
Oh, I'm be embarrassed to say, but it will end. It will end.
It will end. But when you go home tomorrow morning, when you go home, will you go to page 235 where you are, or will you start back?
Actually, I'm right at this point going through the whole thing.
I see.
So I'll pick up about halfway through where I'm doing the writing now. I'm just solidifying things and yeah.
Is your life different when you're writing a novel than it is when you're writing a memoir or short stories?
No, not really. Well, once I know where I'm going with something, then I can begin to relax a little. There's a and I love having finished something and then revising. I love revising because it's already done. That anxiety
Something
of
is
actually producing it, getting it on the page, that is gone. And then you can actually feel like an artist. You're shaping, you're walking around it, you're making aesthetic decisions, you're kind of in charge of it, and you can really express your, really bring out that thing that you wanted to do with it then. But getting it all down first, that's I always thought when I wanted to be a writer, and in the early days, that was the best part, that it was fun.
The first draft.
And the revision was work. That was just something that you had to do. Now I'm totally reversed on it. The hard part is getting it all down, and the fun is revision.
And how do you do first drafts when you do that hard part? Do you do them in one fast blaze?
No.
No.
No, I do everything in a slow blaze. Or I would have written more. I mean,
you've written a lot. But you've got a lot yet to write.
What I think of, Joyce Carol Oates comes and teaches at Stanford now.
Well, Joyce Carol Oates.
I know. It's not somebody
That's not a fair measure.
No, it is not a fair measure. But a lot of really, really fine writers have been much more, have produced much more finished work at my age than I have. And that's kind of a regret for me. In the end, you are who you are, though.
You've written a lot of books.
Well, good. I'm glad it looks like a lot.
It looks like a lot, and it is a lot, in fact. Which is not to say that. Do you feel your way of working has changed? Do you feel you work? This is a question I have that I really am asking from my heart. Do you find that working? Have you found? Are you happier in your work as you go along?
Happy isn't what I feel when I write. No, it really isn't. I don't think it ever was. What I feel when I feel happy is if at the end of the day,
when you have written,
when I have written and I like what I've written,
right,
then I feel a kind of happiness that very few things give me. But in the actual, when I've got my hands in the clay, so to speak, that's not an emotion that I'm looking for, or I'm just really just trying to get things, something's missing here. I need to, so you're in a kind of contest with the material and trying to, but there is unquestionably a happiness in reading a day's work and thinking it's good, and that there's no question about that.
Right.
How about for you?
I would like to be a little happier in my work. Yeah. I would like it to be more fun. But
somebody once said, I forget who it was. Maybe it was said of Henry James, that he felt nothing of his vocation but the pain of it, and he wrote a lot of books.
Although I think it changed when he started dictating to his secretary.
Interesting.
Apparently, he did get happier.
That.
Yeah,
Good.
He liked that. You wrote recently a posthumous book was published of John LaRue's stories, and you wrote and delivered a beautiful talk about that. And I was thinking, because he did some great work in his late years, we've been privileged. I mean, we've been privileged in a way in our time, sort of unusually, by people who've lived to be much older than we are at present, like Alice Munro or William Trevor, and they wrote and they wrote, or Roth, and they wrote and they wrote and they wrote, really to quite advanced ages. So we know so much more of human experience from that.
Yeah, it's true.
Are you looking forward to what do you hope to do in the next 30 years?
Survive them would be a good start. I hope I'll
Artistically.
yeah, I don't know. I don't think I head very well that way. I do. When I finish this book, I definitely have some stories that I want to write.
You're going to do another collection.
Yeah, I'm going to write more stories, and if they make up a good collection, then I'll do another collection. But I don't think long range ahead like that. You're right, though. John Leroux, who had been a teacher and mentor of mine, I really recommend this book. It was published posthumously. John died last spring, but he was writing stories as he was dying, literally. And the New Yorker was publishing these great stories. The last one was called "The Escape," which, unfortunately, or fortunately, however you see it, kind of rhymed with his own exit from this life. And his collection, there's some selected stories, but some new ones as well. It's called "The Heart is a Full Wild Beast," and it's just a wonderful, wonderful collection of stories. He was a real character. He taught at Stanford for many years.
Was he there when you were a Stegner Fellow?
He was.
So he was your teacher,
He
workshop
was,
teacher.
absolutely. Yep. And he gave me my first university teaching job. I was going to go back to teaching this in this high school. And he was one of the funniest men I've ever met. In fact, I ran into a guy he had been a Jesuit for many years, and before leaving the order and marrying. And he taught in a Jesuit boys' high school back east. And I met a guy who'd been a student of his. And I said, God, what was he like? And he told me this wonderful story about John. There was a crotchety old Jesuit who had the classroom in the period before John, and he didn't like John. John was handsome, and he was urbane, and the guy really didn't like him. And so he used to leave nasty messages on the blackboard at the end of his class for John and then John's students to see when they came in. And one of John's students said during class one day, raised his hand and said, "Sir, why don't you leave?" Because then they traded the classroom. "Why don't you leave some messages for him? You could have a battle of wits with him." And John said, "Oh, I would never fight an unarmed man." And that was so him. When I heard that story, I thought, that's my John. That's my John.
That's very funny. Now I know the audience has a lot of questions, and I'm gonna let them ask. But I wanted to ask one question about the story. Do you have a vision of their marriage? I have a vision of them. You leave us. I at least interpreted the story as they would have quite a happy marriage.
I think he's prepared to do what he can to make it so.
And I think she is too.
I mean, that's sort of the deal with, I mean, it's obviously, there's an element of exaggeration in it, but that's kind of the deal when you marry, right? I mean, you find out more.
It's a contract.
And you start forming yourself around those odd things. That we all marry strangers, that's the truth. And as honest in everything as we've tried to be beforehand, we discover that we have married a stranger, and then you learn how to not be a stranger to the one you've married, and do all the things that you know what I mean.
It's a great metaphor. Let's go to some questions from the audience, and the ushers will come to you. So should people raise their hands? How does this work? Will they raise their hands? Okay, yes. Please raise your hands for a question. And the ushers will bring you a microphone.
Hi, I have a question about this boy's life. In this book, the protagonist, Hugh, is very thoughtful boy, and he does a few thoughtless things like all of us. How did you develop your sense of morality? Was it more internal or external? And did you have any guides that led you to become, to develop this adult sense?
I was very fortunate in my growing up. Yeah, I really went off the rails when I was a kid. There's no question about it. And but I knew better because my mother never broke faith with me, even when she was tried to the utmost by things that I did. And she had a kind of interior. I never heard her tell a lie all the years, or even exaggerate. And in fact, I happen to know from others later that was what that it drove my father nuts that she would call him on his bullshit in front of people, she was very literal in her. In her approach to things, and very straight. And so there was that. It's always by example, really, rather than precept, isn't it, that we learn these things. And my brother is 8 years older than I, and he was a real guide to me when I was growing up. When we reestablished contact, and the reading that I did. I mean, you enter into the lives of other people when you read, and you see the choices they make and the consequences of those choices without necessarily anybody giving you the moral of the story. You see in literature a theater of choice and how things are acted, what happens humanly to people. And I really, to the extent that I was able to develop that way, I owe a lot to the reading that I did, and eventually, of course, it's the way we grow up. We begin, especially when you develop empathy for other people. You don't want to do things that hurt them, and that instills a kind of code in you. But yeah, many things come together to make a person.
Another one, please. Sorry, we taped these, so it takes a moment for the microphone.
If you took the top 10 characters in all your works and put them in 2020, what would be the split between voting Democratic or Republican?
Oh my God. That's a funny question. I bet you haven't been asked that before.
No, I haven't. Well, I know my stepfather certainly would have been a Trumpian. And some of the boys I grew up with, for sure. But you're talking about characters in the fiction. That's a little harder to say. But definitely, the mountains in Washington State, where I spent 6 years as a boy, kind of formative years from about 10 to 15. There was a very conservative place, and and I imagine that that Democrats don't do well there, and that the people I knew there and grew up with there, I doubt that many of them would be Democrats.
Yeah. Do you want to say the dedication to, or at the end of the acknowledgments of this boy's life, what you say about your stepfather is kind of wonderful.
Oh, the little pro thing
Yeah.
I have at the beginning. Well, he did used to say this to me all the time. My stepfather used to say to me, whenever he heard me talking, basically, he would say, "Well, you don't know would fill a book." And so, at the beginning of this boy's life, as my first stepfather used to say, "What you don't know would fill a book." Well, here it is.
First of all, thank you for coming and sharing your work and your thoughts about writing. I'd like to know what your early experiences were, what made you decide to write, and how early did you start writing, as well as what were some of the experiences or the factors that you used, the influences to help shape some of your early work?
Well, for some reason or other, I grew up with a single mother, and she worked. So I was alone a lot of the time, and we didn't have a TV, and so I read a lot, and that's always. I mean, if there's one thing that all writers have in common, they were readers, and my mom fed me books, and. I mean, one of the. You have to ask yourself, what was the book that who was the writer who made you want to stay up all night reading and stash extra batteries for when your flashlight got dim and stuff a towel under the door of your bedroom so your mom can't see the light leaking out, and and so those sorts of things. I remember reading an interview with Susan Sontag where she talked about, she became a writer because as a girl she read Søren Kierkegaard, and she probably did. But the guy that did that for me, my mom gave me a book that she had read when she was young by a writer named Albert Payson Terhune. It was called Lad, a Dog, and it was about a collie. And I really liked this book, and so I went to the library, these wonderful neighborhood libraries, and God, I went through all of Albert Payson Terhune's books, and they were, they were narrated by a guy who was, or the main character was the master. That's how he was always called, and he was always surrounded by all these collie dogs. They were always collies, and like in one of the books, the master and his dog have this almost telepathic relationship, which that obtained in a lot of his relations with his collies. Master gets called up for the American Expeditionary Force in World War I, and he goes over, and while he's over there, his dog is beginning to get some feeling that something is really wrong with Master. And he's right. Master's been wounded. He's lying in no man's land. And
Wait, where is the collie?
the collie's back at the farm in New Jersey. He actually had a farm called Terhune, on which he kept like these enormous
Collies.
packs of collies, which he always referred to in this kind of Homeric epithet, the tawny swarm. Anyway, so this dog, this is really kind of a step up from Lassie getting Timmy out of the well. This dog, guided by this powerful tractor beam of intuition and connection with Master, actually gets himself to Belgium and finds Master, who's just on his last breath, and drags him to safety from no man's land. How can you not love these books?
How can you not love it?
So I wrote kind of imitations of that. Then I really got into O. Henry. I loved all the trick endings in O. Henry, and I made up stories. And so I used to write just for fun. I had no thought of being a writer. I didn't know any writers. That wasn't part of the world I grew up in. But I liked writing.
I have two questions, but one is a yes or no question. which I'll do that one first. In your story, Bullet in the Brain, the last line where somebody says, like, oh, shortstop, that's the best position they is. Or that's not the last line, but it comes back.
Right.
Is that character supposed to be black?
No.
Thank
no,
you.
he's Southern.
That's what I thought. I argued with somebody about this recently.
No, he's Southern. Well, that doesn't mean he couldn't be black, but as the story is described, I think it's pretty clear that he's not.
Very satisfying answer. And I
Why? Because you're right.
of course, yes. I didn't review your Wikipedia page like Mona did, but this is your third novel that you're writing now with the.
Well, I wrote it's the third one I admit to.
Or
I have a short novel called The Barracks Thief, and I have a novel called Old School, and the novel that I'm writing now will be my third. That's right.
Or okay, or even if we four if we count the other. How is you talked about how much the advent of computers changed your writing style. How have these experiences of
I don't know
writing
that it
novels
changed
been
my
different?
style. It just enabled all my pathologies that I can, just go back and back and back. You couldn't do that on a typewriter. You had to get through the thing. Then you could go back and mess with it. But yeah, the computer enables somebody to just linger and go back and revisit it again, and it can impede your forward progress. I think I would have written more on. I mean, it's a great instrument, but I'm not entirely sure it's been great for me. I think I would have written more without it.
Do you still have a typewriter?
No, I wouldn't know how to use one.
Hey, Toby.
Yeah.
It's Robert Morgan Fisher.
Ah,
I'm here with my UCLA Word Commandos right here.
great.
And this is a question for both Mona and you. And I love that Mona mentioned In the Garden of North American Martyrs, which is such an amazing story. And I totally identified with what you said about that. I've actually read the battle scene of that story out loud to people. The very end of the story. I won't give it away, but it's just so powerful. And I also wanted to say that The Night in Question is required reading for all of our UCLA Word Commandos. These are veterans who do creative writing, and especially like the other Miller.
I love that story.
You've written so many stories about the military, but I want to circle back though to In the Garden of North American Martyrs. And if you could just kind of talk about the genesis and the writing of that story. And, when I've heard you say in interviews that when you write a story, you like to surprise yourself. If it kind of ends at, if it kind of goes the way you sort of pre-plotted out, it just kind of falls flat. So you kind of wait for that moment. What was the surprising moment in that story for you?
Oh, I hate to disappoint. This kind of reminds me of a moment in, there's a play called The Barretts of Wimpole Street, and it talks about the courtship of Robert Browning and Elizabeth Barrett, who became his wife. And there's a scene in the play where Elizabeth is something of an invalid at the time, before they married, and he goes to visit her because she's been corresponding with him. And she, again, says how much she loves his work. But she said there's this one passage in this poem that I've tried to understand it, and I'm not sure that I do. I wonder if you could tell me what it was that you had in mind. She gives him the book, points to the passage. He reads it. He takes it over to the window, reads it again. He says, "Madam, when I wrote this, only God and I knew what it meant. Now only God knows." And it's a little like that when I try to recall, things I had in mind or things that happened in the writing of a story some years ago. So I don't think I can actually give you an honest answer to that question. Certainly I had surprises in writing it because it started out to be a much different story than the one that I ended up writing. I mean, the main character, no, I won't go into it, but it really was I had a different conception, and it ended up being something different. But just when that happened or how, and I can't recapture that actually with any kind of accuracy. I know I can't.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question.
This is more about the future than the past. Could you tell us something about where you see American fiction going, or what some of the more promising trends are? And if you have time, could you tell us something about the dead ends, or some things that you feel might be dead ends or bad paths to follow?
Well, it may be just the writers that I'm gravitated to, that I gravitate to, the younger writers, but I see a return to what has seemed to me to be the signal strengths of American literature, which is a robust sense of story, of narrative. We live in this country. I mean, I remember Philip Roth saying, "Fiction cannot keep up with the reality of this place," and he's right. But this trust in story and character, which has been so much the backbone of our literature, and we've had interesting tributaries that the postmodernism in which the postmodern tone in literature, in which writers kind of mocked the fictionality of what they were writing, but you get something like, say, John Barth's Lost in the Funhouse, which is actually telling a story while actually dissembling it in front of your eyes and showing how it's made, and I loved reading that, and some of Coover and Walter Abish and other experimental writers, but I think sometimes that almost feels like a kind of coterie. It certainly, I enjoyed reading that. It made me more conscious of what I was actually doing as a writer, sometimes subversively so. What I see in the strongest work of the young writers that I read is this, is faith and story and people, characters to carry stories, and a concern with the things that concern us all. This ability that literature has to offer a kind of, as I used the word theater earlier, but a theater of our own weaknesses and our own difficulties of choice, and how we're always trying to find what the right thing is, or shutting our eyes to what the right thing is. And you read that, you feel a sense of kinship, that these things that these people go through offer you a kind of companionship in the world, the sense that you're not alone. And that sort of literature is, I think, the kind that just continues to endure and to keep our love for it alive.
Thank you so much. They'll be out in the lobby. The bookstore will have come down to bring Tobias Wolff's books for sale. And will you be able to sign some?
Sure.
Okay, great. So right outside in the lobby, we can get our books signed. Thank you so much.
That was great.